So welcome everyone, and today we're going to be speaking to another author from the forthcoming book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. And today we'll be speaking to Mike Higton. So Mike, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, certainly. I'm Mike Higton. I teach theology here at Durham University, where I've been working since about 2013. My job also involves me working quite closely with the Church of England, because Durham University validates much of the Church of England's ministerial training around the country and various ecumenical partners as well. And I'm the academic lead on that process. So although I teach here in Durham, I work with various theological educators all around the country as part of my job.
Okay, thank you. Could you briefly describe what your chapter is about?
Yeah, so I was inspired by reading Willie James Jennings' book, After Whiteness. And that's a powerful account of how theological education is shaped by ways of thinking, by patterns of imagination, and by practices that have racist roots. And I found his account at once sort of recognizable and unrecognizable. I mean, in broad terms, I found it very recognizable, the problems he was identifying and the forms of injustice that they perpetuate. That was very recognizable. But he was talking quite specifically in a North American context. And so the examples he used and the more detailed ways in which he described the kinds of imagination and practice that he was talking about didn't quite match my context. So that the chapter primarily was my attempt to think through, in my UK context, the kinds of questions that Willie James Jennings was raising in that book. What does the power of whiteness, which doesn't just mean the color white, skin color white, but the patterns of imagination that go with white supremacy, white superiority. How do those patterns of imagination actually play out in my context, for me personally, for the institutions with which I'm involved, and how does that shape my practice as a theological educator, and what might it mean to move beyond that, to overcome that? So that, I think, was the main point of the chapter.
Okay, thank you. And I think you've partly answered this question already, but what made you take this particular approach to your chapter?
Yeah, well, I wasn't content just to read this fantastic account from Jennings and think about sort of how it landed on other people, how it landed in contexts other than my own. I really wanted to do some of the work to think through the sort of the personal resonances, the personal impact of the material that he was talking about. And I think the bit of the chapter that I found both most challenging to write and most rewarding to write as I did it is the material at the beginning, which is really focused not so much on the problematic practices and structures, but on the forms of imagination that underlie them, and trying to think through how my own imagination was formed. And I have this sort of image of the self-possessed man, and that's a deliberately gendered term, this idea of the self-possessed man, which is my name for the kind of imagined identity that I see in myself and in the kind of academic culture that surrounds me, a way of imagining, a way of being that I've picked up from countless films and television programs and books, of the man who is sort of master of himself and master of all he surveys. And it's both sort of metaphorically colonialist and in some ways literally colonialist as well, as a pattern of imagination. And I wanted to kind of track that pattern of imagination in myself and see the forms, including some of the forms that I still find myself in a subterranean way attracted to. I still find that's a pull on my imagination, this idea of the self-possessed man. I wanted to trace that through. I think that's the key thing for me in this chapter.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, what would you say has shaped your social conscience? in terms of inclusivity, race, etc.?
That's a big question. In some ways, it would require a whole autobiography to answer it, because it's the answer would be a story of many particular encounters and particular conversations over a long period of time. And perhaps I should say it's absolutely not, in my case, from my own experience of marginalization. Middle-class, white, male, Cambridge-educated academic in a context where that's still often sort of the default. I inhabit a very privileged space. I don't have any significant experience of marginalization or exclusion myself. So it wasn't something I sort of came to naturally as a result of my position. But I have had a series of encounters and conversations over time that have helped me to notice my own privilege and to notice the way that factors into the structures of which I'm a part, the institutions of which I'm a part, and to try and think that through and do something about it. And in specifically in relation to race and ethnicity, I'd pinpoint most recently conversations over the last several years with people like Anthony Reddie, Dulcie Dixon McKenzie, Selena Stone, Sanji Pereira, many others. There's no sort of one moment which led to a conversion, but just a long series of conversations from which I hope I've learned, and I hope I will continue to learn.
Thank you. Another big question. What do you think are the biggest challenges to the church and the wider society in terms of creating frameworks for social justice?
Gosh, that really is a big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so for me, my church context is primarily the Church of England. That's the church of which I'm a part. And if I think about the Church of England, and this may be paralleled in other churches, but sort of focus on my own backyard, as it were. One of the things I see is a real need to be clearer and more transparent in the ways that we acknowledge and talk about power. And especially about the forms of sort of systemic and structural power that can't just be wished away by being affable, by being cheery and friendly, which actually need directly tackling and addressing. And I think when I look around the Church of England, although there are certainly counterexamples and places where there's really good discussion going on the whole, I see a real inability to talk about power. And that means a real inability to face up as much as we need to the inequalities of power and to the forms of marginalization and exclusion that they reproduce. So yeah, that would be one thing, a need to talk more clearly and more transparently about power. And for people who do have power, and I count myself amongst that in various ways, I occupy a position of power and privilege within my church. For those of us who do occupy those sorts of positions, to get better at naming that and building structures of accountability around that, rather than sort of being embarrassed about it and denying it and pretending it's not there, or thinking we can just sort of wish it away. I mean, another thing would be more looking out at the sort of the academic world of which I'm a part, the sort of theological education world. And I'm involved in various ways in projects under the broad heading of decolonizing the curriculum there. And I find that really exciting work, really interesting work, really positive work. But I also think that that's a conversation which, in the kinds of contexts that I inhabit, academic theology in university contexts and theological education in church contexts, that conversation's still in its infancy, and there's quite a lot of resistance, some of it based on ignorance and misunderstanding, and some of it not, some of it based on a desire to resist the way that things are going. So I think greater maturity in that conversation is, and in the processes of change that it's driving, that's something that we need. And actually one sign of hope in that is discussed in my chapter. I talk in the chapter a bit about this academic organization that runs conferences, the Society for the Study of Theology, and the way in which that has changed over the last few years, really quite dramatically in terms of the diversity of voices present in the society's conversations. And so I do see that the academic world, the sort of academic theological world, is changing. I don't want to be complacent about that or think that the task is finished or that the gains that have been recently are all secure. Nevertheless, I think there is change happening. And I guess the sort of thing, the challenge I see there is to persist with that change and to make that, help that change really bed down and become normal in the contexts in which I work.
Thank you. So just finally, what would you like people to take away from reading your chapter?
I think I said a little while ago that the key thing for me, and the thing I found both most challenging and rewarding, was trying to think through in my own imagination, the way my mind works, the way I sort of see the world and see myself, how whiteness played out. And my hope is that people who read this chapter won't just sort of, as it were, find out a bit about how things work for me and my context, but particularly people who occupy similarly privileged positions to me will be inspired to do some of the analogous work themselves, that they will see ways of thinking through how their imaginations and practices might be shaped in similar ways. No doubt there'll be differences as well, but there might be some overlaps and similarities. So I hope a sort of challenge to do some of the same work that I'm involved in, which I in turn have been challenged to do by many of those people I named earlier who've helped begin on this journey. So it's certainly not sort of a takeaway, here are some answers, but an invitation to an ongoing process, I hope.
Well, it's been great hearing your insights, and I'm sure people watching will be interested to read your chapter when the book comes out in the summer. So thanks again, Mike Higton, for your insights.
Thank you. Really good to talk to you.
Thanks.